Hello, I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith, and welcome to The Interview. Faced with the ravages of climate change, the fallout from the pandemic, and the shocks from the war in Ukraine, food systems everywhere are teetering on the brink of catastrophe. The UN reckons that around the world, at least 345 million people are just a step away from famine, and that the crisis is getting worse. Well, to look at all of this, I'm joined now by Cary Fowler, the US Special Envoy for Global Food Security. Cary, thanks so much for speaking to me. Now, the food crisis is a global problem, but Africa is the continent with the most people struggling to eat, about a quarter affected by hunger. First of all, give us a bit of a sense as to why it's been hit quite so hard, and what are some of the specific hurdles the continent's facing?
Sure. Well, Africa certainly has been hit hard by climate change. The Horn of Africa, for example, has just been through 4 years of excessive drought. They're headed towards the fifth. The fourth was setting a record. The fifth, of course, will exceed that record. And there have been a number of other challenges that Africa has faced. Obviously, one of the biggest ones is conflict. If you look at the main drivers today of food insecurity, they are climate change, COVID, and conflict. But in addition to that, we've also had historically low grain stockpiles. We have high prices for fertilizer, for example, and availability issues. So when you combine all these things, it's not surprising that it hits Africa the hardest.
And what have been some of the specific strategies in tackling the continent's food crisis issues? So you've outlined there what the problems are. Have the responses to that been tailored uniquely to Africa's needs?
Yes, well, there have been a couple of different categories of response, I would say. Certainly we have doubled down on our humanitarian assistance. The United States has provided $5.7 billion to the World Food Program this year. We're the largest donor by far. We've surged that, if you will, in the Horn of Africa by $1.3 billion, I think, just to address those needs. But then long term, we're also very much engaged in agricultural development programs on the continent. We just recently announced an expansion of our flagship Feed the Future program. These are countries where we really concentrate our agricultural development. We had 12 of those countries, mostly African, in the past. We expanded that to 20 just recently. 16 out of the 20 are African. And we're going to be looking at a comprehensive list of interventions there that will help people grow more food, be more resilient, better able to cope with these kinds of natural disasters and even conflict in the future. As you know, Africa is set to be the world's most populous continent by the end of the century. So food security problems there really must be overcome if we're going to have a food secure world.
Now, you mentioned that the drought in the Horn of Africa, also the impact that conflicts had. Now, on the 30th of August, the ship, the Brave Commander, arrived in Djibouti with, I think it's 23,000 tons of grain on board. That's meant to feed about 1.5 million people in Ethiopia for a month. Now, Ethiopia is right in the center of that, of the countries being affected by drought. And of course, there is that conflict that's been dragging on since the end of 2020. Now, 23,000 tons sounds like a lot, but will it really make that much of a dent in an area that's been so hard pressed when it comes to the humanitarian food emergency?
Yeah. Well, the grain, the 23,000 metric tons that you mentioned on the Brave Commander, really sends a powerful message, and that message is that Ukraine's grain is getting out and it's getting to the world's hungry. Ukraine is one of the top 5 exporters of corn, of wheat, of barley, of sunflower, and much of that grain historically has gone to fairly poor countries in the Mideast and North Africa and Africa. So what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine was it was all blocked. And so for many, many months, the harvests in Ukraine haven't been able to get out to the people that really need it. And so we have seen food prices drop down a little bit since that. since the agreement was made that allowed the first ships to get out. The Brave Commander is destined to unload its food and which will be available for people in Ethiopia and Somalia. And just to give your listeners and viewers a sense of how much grain that is, 23,000 metric tons is enough to produce about 60 million loaves of bread. But to put this in context, still, if you think of 23,000 metric tons producing 60 million loaves of bread, be aware that there are 20 million metric tons still in Ukraine that have to get out. They could get out very quickly if the war were to end, and that's a decision that Mr. Putin could make tonight. But otherwise, the United States has been working very diligently with its allies and, of course, with Ukrainians to find different routes for export for Ukraine's grain. It's so vital to world food supplies.
But when it comes to Africa, I mean, should it be quite so reliant on wheat from Eastern Europe? You know, it's, I think between Russia and Ukraine, that's responsible for about 40% of Africa's wheat supply. But the continent has a huge diversity of other crops that could be invested in. Why has wheat become the biggest imported crop on the continent?
Well, wheat has become a popular crop there, and we're quite conscious of that, but we're also working very much to increase production of more traditional foods. We've been actively promoting a drought-tolerant maize, corn for southern Africa. That's grown on about 17 million acres in southern Africa, and the interesting thing there is that on average, that maize will produce about 30% more every year. That makes up for, of course, a lot of humanitarian assistance and makes the small farmers there more independent. But I think looking forward, we also have to pay much more attention, and we are, to what we would call minor crops and the fruits and vegetables. These are critical to food security. They're particularly important for women, lactating women and children, because they supply much needed vitamins and micronutrients. And they're grown very often right next to the home in home gardens. And in a sense, if you think about food security, there's nothing that gives you more food security than having food grown right outside of your doorway. So we are looking at ways of increasing production, overcoming some of the production hurdles that some of those crops face, and I think that will be very important, in particular, as I mentioned, to women and children.
So, considering that Africa's food crisis is so dire at the moment, can we actually, though, say that it is a new phenomenon? Because, you know, on one hand, to some extent, the war in Ukraine was somewhat of a surprise, the fallout from COVID as well. But with parts of East Africa having seen drought for years now, should world leaders and some of those expressing so publicly so much concern about the continent's food security have been better prepared? Should they have been able to see this coming?
Well, it's hard to say that we shouldn't have been better prepared. I've been working in this field since the mid-'70s, and I think one of the things that I've noticed most about the current situation is that unlike previous famines and acute food insecure situations, this one is really caused by multiple causal factors. So in the past, you might have had a drought or some other situation like that plunged people into food insecurity or famine. Today, we have climate, we have COVID, we have conflict, we have all the other issues that I mentioned earlier. And what that means, I think, is that this is going to be a crisis that unfolds over several years. It can't easily be solved in 1 year. We're going to have to go through a couple of cropping seasons. And it also means that we have to really understand farming systems, particularly in Africa, and be prepared to address the totality of issues that are involved. It's going to take a comprehensive approach, and it's going to have to take our working on multiple fronts, if you will. But I think the hopeful thing about what has just happened with the docking of the ship and the food destined for Ethiopia and Somalia is that it gives us some hope. And it relieves the immediate pressures. We can see some of the food prices going down. Is it enough? Is it going to solve the problem completely? No, but it's a step in the right direction.
And considering the scale of the crisis, obviously, the role of the international community is crucial. But do you think that the national policies that you've seen being put in place in African countries are enough to, in their scope, to try and cushion the impact of the crisis, cushion people from the impact of the crisis? And what would you like to see more of in that regard?
Yeah, well, we've been very active, I would say, diplomatically here at the State Department. For example, in arguing that countries should not impose export bans so that we can have free trade in food and make up for some of these gaps that we're experiencing in Africa. African countries themselves have set their own standards in a process about having to do with food security in those countries. And some of those standards, for example, involve the percentage of their national budget that should be devoted to agricultural research. Most of those countries, honestly, are failing to meet their own self-imposed standards, so certainly we're encouraging them to step up themselves, understanding full well the kind of situation that most of them find themselves in today. But somehow we do have to come together with our partners in Africa and other more developed countries to try to address these issues in a really comprehensive way.
Thank you so much for your time, Cary Fowler, the US Special Envoy for Global Food Security. That, unfortunately, is all we have time for the interview. Thanks for joining us. Stay with us. More coming up.